Hi, I'm Aline, and this is the story of how a Thanksgiving market, a glass of wine, and my sister's laughter led to something I never saw coming: national TV, and a kind of redemption that spoke louder than any apology. She used to call my handmade crafts kindergarten stuff, and I believed her for years. But sometimes all it takes is one unexpected spotlight to remind the world and yourself that quiet effort doesn't mean small dreams. Before we go any further, tell me, have you ever felt underestimated by the people closest to you? If yes, comment number 1. If no, comment number 0. This is a family drama you don't want to miss. Emily always had a way of making my dreams sound like punchlines at her comedy night. It wasn't always this sharp, this pointed. There were days when we'd sit in the sunroom, two little girls sketching dresses on napkins, while Mom hummed old Glenn Miller tunes in the kitchen. But somewhere along the way, Emily's lines got cleaner, her internships glossier, and her words sharper. Mine? My lines were hand-stitched, my projects done under lamplight beside chipped teacups and fabric scraps. Saturday morning started with the usual clatter of Emily's weekend drop-ins, heels clicking across hardwood like punctuation. She flung her bag on the chair and eyed the wreath I was working on, bits of dried orange and cinnamon sticks nestled between pine cones. "That's cute," she said, smiling the way someone smiles at a drawing from a toddler. "I mean, for a hobby." I paused, my fingers still weaving twine. "It's not a hobby," I replied, steady but soft. "I'm prepping for the winter market." Clarice offered me a booth. That caught her. "The Clarice from Main Street?" She laughed. "Aline, she's like an antique herself. No one even watches her TV spots." "She offered me a chance," I said, voice tightening. "I'm taking it." Emily raised her brows, grabbing sparkling water from Mom's fridge. "Well, don't say I didn't warn you when you end up selling 3 pine cones and a paper cut." She left before I could gather my words. Later, I found Mom sorting old dishes in the garage. I showed her my newest wall hanging, woven from reclaimed wool, with a hand-painted winter barn in the center. She smiled and said it reminded her of the one her grandmother made back in '49, all reds and grays. For a moment, I saw pride flicker. But then Emily's voice echoed from the living room, and the moment passed like breath on glass. I stayed up that night sketching layouts, candles flickering around me. The town's winter market was only 3 weeks away, and my corner of the world, cluttered as it was, felt like the only place where my dreams had room to stretch, even if nobody else saw it yet. By Sunday evening, I'd mailed in my vendor form and booked the permit fee, using the last of my teaching side gig money. I was all in. The next morning, Emily's voice echoed through the hall again, sharp and dismissive, as she recounted my craft fair delusion over brunch with Mom and one of her clients. But as I returned to my studio space, our converted old shed, I picked up a bundle of dried lavender and smiled. I had no idea then that Clarice was about to walk in and change the course of everything. She stepped into my little workshop just before noon, bundled in a navy pea coat and wearing that familiar red lipstick she'd sported on local TV since the early '90s. Her cane tapped once on the threshold before she looked around with a slow, appraising gaze. "I thought this place had been turned into storage," she said, eyes drifting over my table, strewn with cinnamon stars and vintage ribbon. "But I see life here." I scrambled to clear a stool. "Clarice, thank you for stopping by. I didn't expect—" She waved a hand. "You sent samples. I had to see if they were a fluke." She picked up a felt cardinal, stitched onto a linen coaster, and nodded. "This isn't just crafts, Aline. It's memory, texture, heart." I exhaled, suddenly aware of how cold my hands were. I've been prepping for the market, I said. I hope it's not too ambitious. Clarice looked me square in the eye. Ambition's not your problem. Believing you belong, that's your mountain. She stayed for nearly 40 minutes, moving slowly, asking questions, scribbling notes in her little leather pad. Before she left, she placed a small gold pin on the corner of my shelf. It was shaped like a snowflake. You'll wear that the day the cameras come, she said. We're running a segment on local artisans who make Christmas from scratch. When she was gone, I stood there in silence, still holding the ribbon she'd touched. It was the first time in years someone outside the family had looked at my work and called it valuable. I was still floating from that when Emily dropped by again, uninvited as usual. She came bearing a gingerbread latte and a sharp tongue. Saw your name on the vendor list, she said, poking around without asking. You do know they film these things, right? Do you even have a website? Or are you still operating in the Stone Age? I stayed calm. I'm building something real, Emily. Something that lasts. She looked around, eyes skimming past the stacks of dried citrus and birch bark stars. If this flops, she said, don't come crying to me. I didn't reply. But that night, I stitched until my fingers ached, candle wax pooling low in the jar. For the first time in a long while, my fear was smaller than my hope. Feeling that my relatives look down on me and mock me about my profession. But in return, I get support and help from outsiders. Have you ever felt like I do now? If you have ever been in my current state, please leave a comment number 9 in the comment section below. Now, let's get to the next development of the story. The invitation came on a Wednesday morning, tucked between a utility bill and a coupon flyer. It was printed on thick cream stock, the kind that felt like it belonged in a keepsake box. The letterhead read Morning Light News, Holiday Spotlight. My hands trembled slightly as I read Clarice's neat handwriting at the bottom. We film Sunday. Be ready. I must have read it 3 times before calling her. Clarice, this is too much, I said, pacing the narrow hallway between my kitchen and workspace. I'm not ready. I have 2 crates of half-finished ornaments and no signage. You'll never feel ready, she said, her voice warm, unhurried. But that doesn't mean you aren't. The next 3 days blurred into a tangle of fabric, thread, and cinnamon. I worked under the soft glow of string lights, ironing linen, and hand-painting holiday tags until dawn. I borrowed a folding table from Mrs. Capel across the street and asked the local baker, sweet old Walter, for his leftover coffee sacks to use as rustic tablecloths. But under all that motion, a quiet dread settled in. What if I froze on camera? What if the world saw me the way Emily did? Quaint, outdated, irrelevant. Saturday evening, I decided to take a walk. The neighborhood sparkled with porch lights and pine wreaths. On a corner bench, a young couple laughed as their toddler tried to catch falling snowflakes. A radio played faint Christmas jazz from an open diner window. I stopped by the tree lot near the pharmacy. The same man who sold Dad our trees when we were kids still manned the stand. Thought I'd see you sooner, he said, handing me a mug of cider without asking. Still making those cranberry garlands? I smiled. Something like that? When I got home, I found a voicemail blinking on my landline. Emily. Saw the article online. Wow. You really are going through with it. Just try not to embarrass yourself, Aline. Her voice had that old edge again, the one that cut deeper than she probably meant it to. I sat down at my workbench, stared at the scattered materials, and took a deep breath. The next morning, the news crew arrived, and I nearly blacked out when I saw how many people were watching. There were at least 2 cameramen, a sound technician, a producer named Sheila with a clipboard and an unshakable smile, and a cluster of curious neighbors pretending they just happened to be walking by. My hands felt like ice as Clarice ushered them into my little sunroom studio, now scrubbed, staged, and bathed in morning light. I stood behind my display table, palms flat on burlap, trying to ground myself. "Just talk to me," Clarice whispered, adjusting a pine branch centerpiece. "Forget the cameras." The interview started simply enough. I explained how I made the snowflake garlands by hand, how I sourced vintage fabric for the tree skirts, how I stitched stories into the seams, names, memories, dates. My voice trembled at first, but then something in me shifted. As I spoke, I noticed Sheila nodding, genuinely listening. One cameraman leaned in to get a close-up of my ornament with the blue cardinal. I began to relax. Then they asked the question I dreaded. "What inspired you to start this?" I glanced out the window. The morning light was softer now, like it understood something about me. "My mom used to make everything by hand," I said quietly. "Our holidays weren't perfect, but they were full of love. After she passed, I guess I wanted to hold on to some of that." For a moment, no one said anything. Then Sheila murmured, "That's beautiful. Thank you." They filmed for another hour, me tying bows, explaining techniques, even laughing when I dropped a spool of ribbon that rolled dramatically across the floor. By the end, the crew seemed more like guests than strangers. After they packed up, Clara stayed behind. "You did it," she beamed, "and you were wonderful." I felt lighter than I had in months, until I checked my phone. Emily had posted a public comment under the station's promotional post. "Glad my sister finally found a hobby. Maybe now she'll stop acting like she's the family matriarch." The sting came fast and hot. In front of thousands, she'd reduced my work, my healing, to a punchline. The comments were flooding in, and to my surprise, most were defending me. At first, I braced for the usual: sarcasm, side eyes, maybe a few pitying emojis. But instead, strangers chimed in. "This is what the holidays are about. Such a thoughtful woman. I'd love to buy her work." Some even shared their own memories of handmade ornaments, of mothers long gone, of quiet winters, and kitchen tables covered in fabric and glue. I sat there, stunned. Then Clarice called. "You're trending locally," she said, her voice full of delight. "Did you see? The station just posted a follow-up. Crafting with Heart, Aline's Christmas Legacy." My hands trembled, but not from fear this time. Over the next few days, orders began trickling in. A woman from Oregon asked for a snowflake garland, like the one in the background of the video. A man from Michigan wanted a set of hand-sewn tree skirt patches. I worked late into the evening, the radio humming softly, a mug of peppermint tea nearby. Emily didn't say another word online. But Mom called. "I just saw the video," she said. "You looked different. Calm. Like yourself again." There was a long pause. "I didn't realize how much you'd been carrying," she continued, "and how little I really saw you." I didn't know how to respond, so I said nothing, but she didn't seem to mind the silence. Later that evening, I stepped outside to take the trash out and found something waiting on my porch. A wrapped box, plain brown paper, tied with green twine. No name. Inside was a single ornament, deep blue, stitched with the words, "For all the seasons you held us together." My breath caught. Clarice insisted it wasn't from her. Neither did any of my friends. I never found out who sent it, but somehow that made it more perfect. A few days later, a letter arrived from a local community center, inviting me to teach a holiday crafting class. The community center smelled faintly of pine and cinnamon. Tables were set up with felt scraps, glitter, jars of buttons, and string. I stood at the front, holding a hot glue gun in one hand and trying not to laugh at how nervous I felt. About a dozen people, some older than me, some much younger, waited, curious and warm-eyed. Among them, two teenage girls whispered and giggled as they fiddled with pom-poms. I cleared my throat, smiled. Let's start with something simple. Stars, that first hour flew by. There was laughter when the glue misbehaved, jokes about crooked snowmen, and stories. So many stories. A retired teacher told me about making angels with her students back in '78. A young mom said her toddler had never had a handmade ornament before. Somewhere between the mess and the memories, I felt a strange peace settle over me. During the break, I stepped out into the hall to breathe. That's when I heard the familiar voice. "I saw the segment," Emily said, walking up slowly. She looked different, less sure, more real. "I know I hurt you," she continued. "I just didn't know how to deal with you doing something I couldn't control." I looked at her, really looked. For once, she wasn't performing. "You don't have to explain," I said quietly. "I'm not the same person I was 2 months ago. And honestly, I'm glad." She nodded, not pushing it. "I'm proud of you, Aline. Truly." That night, I got home to find the girls from class had left something on my doorstep. A small cake box tied with gold string. Inside was a simple lemon bundt cake, a note attached. "Thank you for teaching us how to create something that matters." I sat down in the kitchen, sunlight catching the edges of the window, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like someone struggling to keep up. I felt seen. I smiled and whispered to myself, maybe this was the dream all along. There's a quiet kind of joy that comes from being seen, not for what you've achieved, but for what you've carried. In the end, it wasn't fame or recognition that changed my world. It was a simple cake, left on a doorstep, baked by hands she'd once encouraged. Kindness has a way of echoing back to us, often from places we least expect. When we choose not to judge, but to believe in the quiet dreams of others, we become part of something greater than ourselves. So if this story stayed with you, maybe take a moment today to notice someone whose light is just beginning to flicker. You might be the reason it shines.